And we'll, there we go. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and the VHB team will start sharing now.
Awesome. Thank you, Stuart. Give me 1 second. I'll get my screen up here. Stuart, can you just confirm you're seeing the presentation?
I am. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Thanks to Stuart and Bill and the entire team at Coalition for Smarter Growth for giving us the opportunity to talk about these two projects. We're really excited about them, and hope that everyone walks away with knowing a little bit more about the corridors today. Like Bill said, my name's Doug Davies. I'm Director of Planning and Design for VHB. And I'm joined by my colleague, Kevin Keeley, who's a senior planner with the team. So today we're going to go over just a few things. We're going to talk a little bit about reimagining DC corridors, try to give some perspective and framework to the discussion that we're going to have. Then we'll dive into Penn Ave West, Penn Ave Southeast, and then we'll cover some quick lessons learned that we took away from these two projects. I'm going to start today on a relatively banal graphic here, but I think this is a really great first stop for us. This is DDOT's capital projects map, and there's a lot of things here that excite me about this map, but one that might be easier for locals to see is that some of the most important corridors in the city are on this map, including Pennsylvania Avenue, Benning Road, Cleveland Park, Streetscape, South Capitol Street, Alabama Avenue, and many, many others. The point being that the DDOT and the city are doing a lot of work right now. It's at a very large scale, reaches all across the district, all across the wards, and has an opportunity to really change mobility in the district dramatically. These projects, in conjunction with several key planning reports like Move DC and the Vision Zero initiative, indicate a really bright future for multi-mobility in the district. All that said, there's a lot of work ahead of us. These corridors are large. There's a lot of blue lines on here. And as we get into some of the slides, you'll see that every inch of roadway is certainly more complex than some give it credit for. But if these projects are to deliver on the potential, we can see some really exciting things. Okay, so what's so special about Pennsylvania Avenue? Well, for starters, we think it's a relatively unique corridor, not just because the big guy lives at 1600, but because this corridor has been an enormously diverse set of constituents. Penn Ave West is filled with a lot of global entities like World Bank, IMF, the Mexican Embassy, while Penn Ave Southeast is home to a lot of locals. There's lots of bars, restaurants, shops, housing along that corridor, but it's all Penn Ave. I chose this map to overlay them because while you can see these two stretches are outside of the monumental core indicated by the black dashed line there, these contribute greatly to the symbolic nature and the vistas, both looking out of the core and into the core. So we think that's a really important framework for both of these corridors and sort of sets us up for the magnitude of some of the challenges that we had to face there. So the first project we're going to jump into is Penn Ave West. I know that was a really short intro, but promise we'll build on some of those themes as we move on through the deck here. The history of Penn Ave starts before the district. Penn Ave was a connection between the federal city and Georgetown. It has had a really interesting transition or history of transportation. It started as, horse and buggy. Then my favorite here is, I actually included it in the graphic here, the horse-drawn streetcars, which I think are really fun. Modern streetcars, buses, metro cars. And our project is looking to continue that history of evolving the transportation landscape. So just like they transitioned from horse and buggy to the streetcar, we're trying to bring the corridor up to more modern needs. So today, the corridor is really characterized by being an extremely wide 8-lane, including parking, corridor. Most of the intersections, as many of you locals will know, the diagonal streets really create very long crossing distances. The wide corridor here, the monumental nature of this corridor creates really long crossings, both laterally and longitudinally along the corridor. The streetscape is quite varied. While there are some cafe spaces, they're sort of indiscriminately placed and don't have a lot of logic and order to them. Here you can see that the plaza extends very far, leaving a relatively narrow area for peds. There's bike parking in here, there's trash in here, there's public parking, there's a shuttle bus here. You know, there's just a lot of demands on the entirety of the corridor. Further, the corridor, the pavement of the corridor is kind of all over the place. We have stretches of granite in front of some of the institutions. We have brick, particularly in front of the Mexican embassy, but some other stretches as well. Concrete pavers, cast in place concrete. It's really just disjointed right now. There's just a lot of things going on that have sort of just happened one by one over the years. While there are some spaces carved out for parks, and you can see one here to the left, there's two couplets of James Monroe and Edward Murrow. These spaces are disconnected from one another and from the corridor itself. So the question we asked ourselves when we went to work with DDOT on this was, how do we go from something that looks like this to something that looks like this? Protected bike lanes, stormwater management features throughout, increased public space, a combination of pickup and drop-off activities, loading, unloading, bus, transit, many more. So how do we make that transition? Well, you know, the interesting thing is that it actually takes quite a lot. This being a monumental corridor, you know, some of the themes that we were really trying to pursue here was to have symmetry in the corridor. Well, to do that, you really have to start underground with what you can't see. So the graphic in the upper right and the main graphic at the bottom there, you can see all these little gray lines. All those little gray lines are sewer, communications, you name it, it's underground, electric wires, all kinds of things underground there. This corridor used to be home to rows of townhomes, and each townhome had its own manhole out front. So there's just a lot of varied infrastructure out here. But the important part is that when you're trying to design over top of it, you have to be cognizant of what's underground. So the map at the bottom there is pairings of trees trying to get the streetscape to be as aligned as possible. But you can see that we had a lot of conflicts in the way. One of the main ones being that the corridor today, because this project isn't built yet, has about 6 catch basins for the half mile. So there's just a significant amount of work going into bringing the corridor up on stormwater management standards and retention, detention, and conveyance that really complicated our ability to be able to place the alley of trees throughout the corridor. That paired with the goal of increasing the tree canopy quite significantly, about 70%, meant that we had quite a challenge ahead of us. So once we had a better understanding of all that, including the subsurface utilities, we needed the public's input to ensure that we were on the right track. This engagement happened on both sides of COVID. So we were able to have one in-person meeting with really great participation. You can see it in the upper right there. We had a role plan of the whole project out. We had a lot of positive feedback, a lot of areas for improvement. But our second round was completely virtual. So we had to ramp up the engagement to entice folks to see, comment, engage. So what we did was we built a project website, or rather we built out more fully the existing project website to have 360 street views, way more renderings of the corridor. And we did all of that using our model-based design software. So that's a little bit of a jargony term, but really what it means is that all of the graphics accurately show where the manholes are, where the catch basins are, where the storm detention areas are. All of that underground infrastructure you can see in the graphic so that you can start to understand why some things might be where they are and why it might not be perfectly aligned. I think that was really well. We also had a recorded presentation that was hosted on the site so that you could kind of join anytime you wanted to get an update of the project. So the project by numbers here a little bit. I'm not going to read all of these. I think there's a couple key ones that I think are really great. The first being that 50% reduction in crossing length. This was a huge accomplishment on this corridor. We essentially halved the amount of right-of-way for cars here, which is no small feat. We were able to add just over a mile of bike lanes. And then I think really interesting to me is that we were able to keep about 72%, we're about to keep 75% of the existing trees and then increase by 72%. So with that reduction in crossing length, that almost a little over 1.5 acres, we were able to get quite a bit of new landscape and trees into the corridor while trying to accommodate, all the different uses that we had. A little bit more on that model-based design. I think this is a kind of a good example of where the model-based design really helped us understand the complexities of those subsurface utilities coming up to the surface. You can see in the graphic here, this is a bus island, has access from the intersection, but you can see here that the railing along the backside has a little bump out there about midway through. This was to accommodate a couple of manholes for a gigantic, I believe it was a 6x6 brick storm sewer that we definitely weren't going to be able to move. But because we were able to use the model-based design software, we were able to see where those manholes were in conjunction with the lighting and make sure that there was no conflict between for ADA to get to and from the bus stop here. You can see also in here, there's some manholes, and so a lot of the stormwater infrastructure was able to be modeled in here. And as I mentioned, another interesting part was, only having about 5 catch basins meant that we had just an enormous amount of stormwater that we had to accommodate, and we had to try to infiltrate through bioretention and tree box filters as much as we could. You can see a triple inlet here, just to give you an idea of the volume of stormwater that we had to manage. And then on the left-hand side here, you can see that we had a fairly significantly sized bioretention cell to accommodate that. So really the challenge here is, where do you put the stormwater? Where do you put the bike lanes? How do you make sure that those things don't conflict so that you can sort of solve all of these various problems all at once? Here, I think, as I mentioned earlier, some of those long crossing distances, this was one area that we really wanted to focus on. So these are some of the diagonal, or some of the regular street grids intersecting with Penn Ave, and the proposed image there, you can see we were able basically to reduce that crossing distance by about 2/3. In doing so, we were able to create small public plazas at 3 different locations along the corridor where this fit in. So this really great dual purpose of reclaiming some of the roadway for pedestrians, creating some public open space, and just greatly enhancing both the look and feel and the safety of the corridor by reducing these crossing distances. On the left, you can just kind of see, this was one of our very first graphics that we produced, trying to understand just how much of the corridor would be shrunk down. Now, the corridor changes quite a bit throughout, so this is just a generic cross section, but essentially these 2 large landscape islands buffering the bike lanes is the major intervention here. We were able to keep the existing curb line, the outside curb lines, which dramatically sort of reduced the challenge of redeveloping the corridor. For the sidewalk sections, I think the thing we want to talk about of this slide is that we worked with all the folks along the corridor to develop what we call the walking zone. And so the intention here is that there would be one single continuous walking zone the entire length of the corridor that reads very clearly, but that there would be a frontage zone where if specialty pavers were desired, cafes, et cetera, that could happen in that space. Or you could hop to the other side of that walking zone, and we just have two images here in the bottom right of some cafe seating and some bench seating, but those could be bike parking, they could be scooter parking, you know, that the programming of those spaces could be different, but buffered on either side, or the walking zone being buffered by that on both sides. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to toss it over to Kevin to talk about Penn Ave Southeast. And Kevin, I'm going to try to keep up with advancing the slides as best I can.
Sure. Thanks, Doug. And I'll keep you honest in that regard. So we are now going to pan to the southeast, just east of the Capitol, and take a look at another case study, also Pennsylvania Avenue, but a different segment here, one that has a lot of significance, but quite a different character from Penn Ave West. A little bit of the history here. It's long been like Penn Ave West. Penn Ave Southeast has been always been a significant contributor to the character of the district, dating back to the L'Enfant Plan, and even now it's identified as a preeminent viewshed in the comprehensive plan. Most of the corridor here, and the corridor, just to define it, is between 2nd Street Southeast and Barney Circle, just west of the river. Most of the corridor falls within the Capitol Hill Historic District, and it's also long has a long history of being a key component of the regional transportation system. As part of that, it's had dedicated transit service for well over 100 years, starting with the streetcar back in the early 20th century. And since the 1970s, it's been home to 2 metro stations, Potomac Avenue at the eastern end and Eastern Market. Today, Doug, if you can, yep, thanks. So today, Penn Ave Southeast is a busy corridor. It features a wide array of contexts and uses. It's really a commercial center for the Capitol Hill neighborhood. It's very vibrant, very active. It has street level retail, bars and restaurants, residential, and metro station areas that are increasingly being activated. But the roadway itself, Pennsylvania Ave Southeast, has tended to prioritize vehicular travel over other modes. So you'll see this is borne out in the next slide in the cross section, where we have three travel lanes in each direction and then a parking lane. So there's a lot of pavement here, separated by a planted median, and it's important to note that the median along the length of the corridor is owned by the National Park Service. So a key consideration there. So what is a vibrant corridor, a very active corridor, there's a bit of incongruity here between that street level activity on the edges of the corridor and the character of the roadway. And needless to say, it's biking here traditionally has been not for the faint of heart. So jumping to the challenge here, really at the core of it is that this corridor, Penn Ave Southeast, is kind of being asked to be everything to everyone. It is the part of the commercial heart, retail heart of the Capitol Hill neighborhood. It's a key transportation corridor. There are numerous cultural and historical considerations here, and so there's just a lot of demands here. For instance, in Move DC, it's identified as a freight corridor, it's identified as a transit corridor, but it's also identified for a dedicated bike facility. So that's a lot of competition. Even though there is a lot of roadway space here, that's still a lot of competing demands for the allocation of that space. However, to their credit, DDOT sensed that there was an opportunity here to address this imbalance in how roadway space has traditionally been allocated on the corridor. So nominally, this project was about planning and designing a dedicated bike facility that's comfortable and intuitive along the length of the corridor. But also DDOT was really interested in leveraging this project to, think about reorganization of the roadway, of the curbside in a way that's more equitable and that just more closely aligns with the needs and the demands of the current uses along the corridor. So how did we go about exploring solutions? So first, we worked with DDOT to establish some guardrails here, some design principles that helped as we developed concepts and evaluated those concepts. We started by casting a fairly wide net in considering preliminary options, and that was with input from both DDOT and the ANC. So we had 9 preliminary options to begin with, an array of different treatments, from a dedicated trail in the median to different configurations of buffered and separated bike lanes on the inside and the outside of the roadway, cycle tracks. And then we evaluated those against the design principles to screen out those that didn't meet all 4 design principles. So that led us to 3 candidate alternatives that were determined to align with all 4 design principles, and those were separated bike lanes on the outside curb, with and without parking restrictions. And then the third alternative was separated bike lanes adjacent to the median. So we advanced those 3 alternatives through the analysis phase, looked at a variety of considerations, including crash history, potential conflict locations, and there were numerous. It's a very active curbside. It's also in the median, there's a lot of vehicle storage at intersections. They end up serving as de facto left turn lanes in some cases. So a lot of spillback from the median. A lot of considerations for curbside demand, bus stops, bus loading, parking, pickup, drop off. And then, of course, considering impacts to traffic operations. So in addition to that analysis, we also took what we had learned from the analysis. We took the 3 concepts out to the public as part of a public meeting and a subsequent public comment phase. And based on the input that was received through that public engagement phase and the findings from the analysis, DDOT selected alternative A as their preferred alternative to advance to design. So looking at the next slide, just to get a sense of what that looks like, we have curbside bike lanes with separation, and then 2 full-time travel lanes in each direction. And then the outside lane has been reclaimed for peak hour bus lane and then off-peak parking. And some of the key factors that led to DDOT to select this is really hearing loud and clear from the public that they much preferred outside curbside bike lanes to median adjacent bike lanes. And that actually aligned with DDOT's thinking because of the spillback, the vehicle spilling back from the median. There really was a high potential for conflict between median adjacent bike lanes and vehicles spilling back from the median storage. DDOT also liked alternative A because it reclaimed that outside lane and could be used for a peak hour bus lane, which enhances transit operations in the corridor, while also in the off-peak meeting parking needs. So really, if you go to the next slide, one other consideration here, in any multimodal corridor is that competition for space and access at the curb. And in this case, in order to fit all of it, the bike lane runs through the bus boarding area, and there's a raised bike table at each bus stop that really signals that, with a combination of the bike table and signage, really signals to cyclists that you're entering a sort of a mixed zone here where you can expect pedestrian activity and that you need to yield to pedestrians boarding the buses. And conversely, bus customers are directed to wait at the curbside until the bus arrives, and then they cross the bike lane to the bus platform, the boarding platform next to the bus lane. Really, the outcomes here, it was an ambitious set of objectives here at the start, and really this, we feel like, ended up in a quite an optimal place, kind of a win-win-win, if you will, where we have the continuous dedicated bike facility with separation along the entire length of the corridor. Not only that, we maintain effective bus operations and actually enhance those with the peak hour bus lane. We preserve on-street parking, which was vitally important to the businesses along the corridor, and also to those who use those businesses, to those customers and residents. And then finally, this maintains acceptable traffic operations. So we did determine that 2 lanes of travel in each direction was adequate, or would be adequate to accommodate the traffic demand on the corridor. And that was just obviously a key to unlocking the potential for reclaiming the outside lane and converting space to a dedicated bike facility. So where things stand now, this alternative A then advanced through design, and this is extremely exciting. We're in the implementation phase. So if you go out there today, the bus lanes have been painted. The bus boarding platforms are currently being installed as we speak. And phase 1 is expected to be operational in the middle of this year. This is broken into 2 phases. So phase 1 is between 2nd Street Southeast and 13th Street Southeast. And then phase 2 will be implemented in coordination with improvements that will take place at the Penn Ave Potomac Ave intersection. So from here, just wanted to close with some thoughts on, what did we learn? We have two very different projects, 2 very different design solutions on the same corridor. And so just wanted to highlight some of our takeaways from this to sort of close the loop on what we just shared.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And to the point you were just making, I think one of the biggest takeaways is to develop a process, not a standard. We approached both of these projects with a similar set of frameworks around mobility, around the environment, around traffic, that led us to very different solutions, whereas a standard would have probably not have delivered the 2 unique designs that each of these corridors required. And that framework, that process that we developed, we think really helped us deliver exactly what the public was looking for, what DDOT wanted to accomplish, and was able to bring together all these disparate pieces to some successful projects.
Great, yeah, and to build on that, in the same vein, you know, this is Pennsylvania Avenue is an iconic corridor. That doesn't mean it can't be context sensitive, as I think the two different design solutions here exemplify. You know, it's and that going back to developing a process rather than just applying a standard really allows for that context sensitive design to come through, and I think it allows for optimal outcomes for different needs in different locations. Another thing we want to highlight here is that we did not do this alone. We had great partners. DDOT has just been really wonderful to work with and a privilege to work with a great, not only a great vision that helped sort of spur these projects and advance them, but a willingness to consider out of the box ideas and creative solutions and really listen. So having great partners and great clients just makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sure everyone knows that, you know, there's a long line of things that happened before our project. Some great work, great planning, great decision making at DDOT, other consultant support that got us here, and it's really nice to be able to be a part of that long line of success for these two projects. My chief civil engineer, Jim Long, would be mad at me if I didn't mention this one, so I definitely wanted to cover this. Double and triple check your utilities. It's going to be one of, you know, in these urban corridors, it is likely going to be one of the key elements that's going to make surface level design decisions for you. You know, some of these utilities are large and prohibitively expensive to move, and if you're not thinking about that from the beginning, a lot of things can go awry. So that's a really important thing to be reminded of, even in the design phase or early planning phases, that there might be something underground that you didn't even think of.
Yep, and another lesson learned here is not to underestimate the positive impact of good engagement. You know, engagement can sometimes be viewed as checking the box or adversarial, but in this case, with when you're trying to design really complex solutions and trying to be context considerate and transformational on some of these arterials and iconic corridors, you need allies. You need all the support you can get, and so that good public engagement can both yield helpful ideas and refinements to ideas, but also generate the allies and support that you need to really push through transformational change.
And to close, just real quick, Stuart, to close, it's okay to be really excited about these projects. You know, I'm an avid cyclist in the city, and I tell you what, I can't wait to bike on both of these corridors when they come online. Really exciting.
Well, that's terrific. We are excited. Thank you both. Thank you, Doug and Kevin, for your presentation here. We are hoping to inspire folks to think about our arterials throughout our region, including in DC. And I like the concept of the public process, public engagement, and somewhat the uniqueness of solutions in some of these complex corridors. Before we go to the Q&A, which I'll have Bill Pugh from our team MC, I did want to recognize that we have one elected official with us. If I missed another one, let me know, but Takis Karantonis from Arlington's board is here. He's sort of a ringer in this because he was the former head of the Columbia Pike Revitalization Organization and an economist who played a key role in rethinking that corridor over the years. I would also be remiss if I did, and I'll put his bio in the chat, But I would also be remiss if I did not mention that we have a special guest on St. Patty's Day at Metro Bar, co-sponsored with Metro Bar, Jeff Speck, author of Walkable City. He has his 10th anniversary edition out with a lot of new additions to it to reflect the pandemic, racial equity, and the many other issues that relate to how we create great streets and safe places for people. So that's St. Patty's Day, Friday, March 17th. And that'll be from 5 to 7 p.m., followed by your usual St. Patty's Day fun, but he'll be doing a book reading and a book signing, and we'll even have a book discount there. I'll put our information about that in the chat as well, and you can go to that page and then link to the registration. So we hope you will join us for that. It's a $25 small donor fundraiser for CSG as well. So let's go into Q&A. Bill, let's start with the chat.
Great. Doug and Kevin and the rest of your VHB team, thank you so much for presenting and your work on this as well. Thank you to DDOT for the team there. Before we get into the chat questions, I did have one a little more big picture, and how do you see these two projects and in particular the Penn Ave West project supporting the district's effort to create a more mixed-use downtown, the mayor's goal to add 15,000 new residences or residents to the downtown. And this is also relevant in some of our suburban arterials that have lots of office space as well, and are looking at ways to transition to a more mixed-use environment.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think it's something that's a little bit inherent in this work. Reclaiming the roadway for people, right? These corridors, Penn Ave West, probably a little bit more than Penn Ave Southeast. The balance of vehicular traffic and pedestrian traffic has changed over time, and the roadway needs to reflect those changes. So being able to add protected bike lanes, that is single-handedly going to make people bike here, right? It feels so much safer. You feel confident being on your bike. You just have to get through the intersections. Those types of things really feel more comfortable for, say, residents that might potentially live near this corridor in the future. Gives you that east-west connectivity. There's some north-south connectivity here as well at 21st Street. And if you get over to the White House, you can get over to the 15th Street cycle track. Those sort of broader webs bring Penn Ave into the fold, as it were, for part of that bike network. The public plazas, creating more public space, more varied public space than the NPS units that are there now, open up a lot of different opportunities. We talked about our partners, the Golden Triangle bid being one of the major partners on this effort. Working with them on making sure that the public space that we're creating is going to be useful for them. They know what's best here. They know their constituents. They know what the folks are looking for here. That creation of public space is really critical to that, I think.
That's great. One question from Dan Reinhardt at VDOT, and that relates to the new materials and maintenance of the materials. Questions, are these going to be maintained by adjacent property owners, or will the district be taking over maintenance of some of the materials on the sidewalk? Definitely an issue when any project with non-standard materials, or some that may be certain jurisdictions may not be used to.
Really complex question there. Very good question. Broadly speaking, the pavers, the main walkway pavers are the DDOT standard pavement. There are a few areas that have different types of pavement. It'll all be maintained by DDOT, but the frontage zone, that little area just towards the building, that's where if an owner would like to have something different, they would enter into an agreement with DDOT to maintain that pavement as non-standard, or whatever they want to put in there, granite, you name it. So there's a little bit of a reset for the corridor, because it's very varied right now. It's kind of all over the place, like I mentioned. But this sort of creates that reset moment and creates a greater sense of delineation between what is publicly maintained and what would be that sort of privately maintained space beyond the walking zone there.
Bill, before you go to the next question, Doug, you can stop sharing, and then everybody can
Oh,
see.
yeah.
And then we'll see if anybody's raised their hands as well. Thanks.
And a couple questions related to how bus lanes connect into this corridor and considerations for bus priority as along these corridors, and also how travel patterns are changing, with reduction in a flattening of the peak of some of the vehicular travel and more emphasis on all-day patterns. And just wanted to see, there was a specific question from Eduardo Plasencia on the connection to the I Street bus lane and a gap there, as well as two other commenters, Ashton Romer and Kate Richter, about thoughts on bus lanes, bus priority, and shifting travel patterns with the flattening of the peak.
Yeah. So for Penn Ave West, the current scheme does not have the contraflow bus lanes coming on to Penn Ave right now. So our design really just accommodated that existing bus service. There may need to be changes in the future to accommodate that, depending on what happens with the H and I Street pairing. But for this effort, that was not part of the coordination.
And on the, I guess I would just add to that for Penn Ave Southeast, the bus lanes in the future, there are dedicated bus lanes identified and moved DC for Independence Avenue along the or south of the mall, so that will tie in the future to the bus lanes on Penn Ave Southeast. Otherwise, those run continuously in the peak hour for the full length of the corridor. Potomac Avenue at Penn Ave Southeast at Potomac Avenue, which is undergoing a redesign with an environmental assessment, and I believe it's entering final design. That is where it gets a little complicated with the bus. I think it may be in mixed traffic through that intersection and then resume in dedicated lanes.
Great. Two questions related to the bike lanes and connections to other parts of the DC's bike system. So one is the connection to other bike facilities. The other is specifically how these were treated at the intersections. And I know all these diagonal intersections, I'm very impressed with your team's work with these complex balancing act among different movements. But how did the cycle tracks transition at the intersections?
So for Penn Ave West, we did look at should we include bike signals, but ultimately the ped signals worked out so that the bikes move with the peds. Those intersections you're talking about, really what makes those much simpler is that we tried to T or 90-degree intersection those diagonals by having the cars sort of turn up a little bit, which greatly reduce that crossing distance and allows for the driver to be looking perpendicularly to the bike lane versus having a really hard skew and having to look, sort of over your left shoulder to see them. On the far east side of the project, the bike lane basically continues onto the closed section of Penn Ave in front of the White House. I'm sure any cyclist here that has gone through there, you never know what the security du jour is going to be there, if it's going to be blocked or open. That's not really something we had a ton of control over, but the intention is that get you across 17th, get you into the pedestrianized zone and connecting to 15th. We were timed a little bit funny with the 21st Street cycle project. So that project will integrate into our project. So our dedicated lanes sort of just cut through that area, and then that project will backfill in there. And then the project limits ended at right before Washington Circle. So we're not necessarily connecting into that circle in a designed way yet. The corridor just stopped at that edge there.
So you left the real fun part for someone else.
Yeah, it's a tough nut to crack, but we'll take a stab at it.
And I'll say on Penn Ave Southeast, we took a really hard look at turning movements, especially right turn, heavy right turn volumes, to determine where a dedicated phase for cyclists would be needed to separate those movements. And in doing that, we looked at MassDOT. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation has guidance on threshold for considering separating those movements. And we took a more conservative approach where we used a lower threshold just to make sure that it is a comfortable journey, and really to try and mitigate the potential for conflicts there. We also worked with DDOT to identify some bus stop consolidation options, and also moving some near side bus stops to the far side of intersections, which just helped mitigate some of those conflict zones as well.
We have time for one more question. One from Jim Epstein in the chat, and this is asking about activation of some of the pocket parks and median areas. You mentioned coordination with the Golden Triangle bid. You also mentioned that in other parts of the corridor, part of the public space is controlled by the National Park Service. Were there opportunities for activating the spaces that you discussed with either entity that might provide some lessons learned for other arterials where other entities control the space and where we want public space?
Yeah, definitely. So the 4 bow tie parks are controlled by NPS within the quarter round curb. So the sidewalks on the outside are DDOT controlled, and that's really where, as I mentioned earlier, those sort of 3 zones where we're able to dramatically reduce the road right of way, we are able to create DDOT public space, right? So where previously it had just been the sort of the average width of the sidewalk throughout the corridor, by really necking down those few intersections, we're able to create more diversity of public space. The NPS parks, the Golden Triangle bid does work with them for public art, but we've been able to create a new venue for them that might reduce some of the paperwork required for some of that along the corridor by creating places for public art all along the corridor. It's amazing the things that you don't get to talk about in a 30-minute presentation, but we worked with the bid very closely on some sculpture pads throughout the corridor, received power and lighting, et cetera, to accommodate that as part of their mission and program. So I think really the important thing is that the diversity of public space is now fed with the Park Service. There's a little bit space for DDOT at some of those intersections. And then, one of the interesting things about the Penn Ave corridor is that the sidewalk widths vary a lot, 30 feet to 6 feet, so there's just these huge different zones. And so that frontage zone for some buildings around cafes can be quite vibrant and quite built out versus some of the narrower sections, particularly along some of the parks. So it's we didn't work with the Park Service insofar as redesigning their facilities, but we tried to add to the types of public space that were out there.
Terrific. Thank you, Bill, for doing the Q&A. Thank you, Doug and Kevin, for presenting. I think one of the key takeaways here is streets are for people, for great placemaking. Honestly, with the pandemic and, you know, people working from home a lot and the problems we're seeing in our downtown, I think placemaking, creating great places where people want to be, will be what keeps various communities competitive. And I think an important part of that is redesigning the streets to create great places for people. So thank you, VHB. Thank you, Lee Farmer, who's on our Champions Council and also at VHB and helped coordinate this with the team here. Thank you all for sponsoring our event, and we appreciate your work. Like I said, we'll try to have other featured arterials in the region. If you're interested in a particular one, let us know. Be sure to sign up with CSG at smartergrowth.net. Don't forget the Jeff Speck event on St. Patty's Day. The link is in the chat here. We'd love to have you there to talk more about walkable streets, walkable communities. And we appreciate all the support you can give to the Coalition for Smarter Growth as we continue to advocate for walkable, transit accessible communities. Again, thank you, VHB team. Thank you, CSG team, and we'll see everybody next time.